But just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a voice called out from the shadows of the trees. "This way!" Jake turned around and saw a figure emerge from the shadows. A young woman whose face was both familiar and unexpected. It was Mia, a girl from his school who had always been a bit of an enigma. She had a reputation for being adventurous and full of resources, and now Jake understood why. "Over here!" she shouted, pointing to a narrow path leading down into a ravine. Wasting no time questioning her motives, Jake and the others followed her, climbing down the steep slope. The hunters hesitated at the edge, unwilling to risk the dangerous descent.
Chapter 1. An Unexpected Encounter. In the quaint town of Maplewood, Kansas, nestled amidst rolling fields and whispering cornstalks, life moved at a gentle pace. The townsfolk knew each other by name, and the days were filled with the simple joys of small-town living. For 10-year-old Jake Harper, however, the world was a vast and mysterious place, full of secrets waiting to be uncovered. His curiosity often led him to explore the outskirts of town, where the dense woods stood like a guardian at the edge of civilization. On a particularly warm Saturday afternoon, with the sun casting dappled shadows through the leaves, Jake set out on one of his usual adventures. His backpack, filled with essentials like a canteen of water, a few snacks, and his trusty pocket knife, bounced lightly against his back as he walked. The path into the forest was well trodden, a testament to the many hours he had spent exploring its depths. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the symphony of nature. Birds chirped overhead, and the rustling of leaves underfoot created a soothing rhythm. Jake loved these moments of solitude, where he could let his imagination run wild. Today, however, he felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something extraordinary was about to happen. He had been walking for about 20 minutes when he first heard a faint, unfamiliar sound that seemed out of place in the familiar forest. It was a soft, plaintive cry, unlike anything he had ever heard before. Jake paused, tilting his head to listen more intently. The sound came again, a little louder this time, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere up ahead. His heart quickened with a mix of excitement and apprehension. What could be making such a noise? He hesitated for a moment, then, driven by an insatiable curiosity, he followed the sound, moving cautiously through the underbrush. The trees grew denser, and the light grew dimmer as he pushed forward. The sound grew more distinct, a mournful, almost desperate cry that tugged at his heart. Finally, he reached a small clearing, and there, in the middle, he saw a small, frightened elephant calf. The calf was huddled on the ground, its large ears flapping weakly as it let out another cry. Its eyes were wide with fear, and it trembled as it looked around, clearly lost and disoriented. Jake's first thought was that he must be dreaming. Elephants didn't just appear in the woods of Kansas, but as he blinked and looked again, the calf was still there, as real as the trees around him. Jake's mind raced. How could this be? Where had it come from? He knew he had to do something, but he was frozen in place, overwhelmed by the sight. The calf let out another cry, and something in Jake snapped into action. He approached slowly, speaking in a soft, soothing voice. "Hey there, little guy," he murmured, trying to sound as calm as possible. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The calf watched him with wary eyes, but its cries subsided slightly. Jake took a few more steps forward, then crouched down, holding out his hand. The calf sniffed at his fingers, its warm breath tickling his skin. Slowly, tentatively, it took a step toward him, and Jake felt a surge of relief. "It's all right," he continued, gently stroking the calf's rough skin. "You're safe now." As he sat there, trying to comfort the frightened animal, Jake realized the enormity of the situation. This was no ordinary lost pet. This was a baby elephant, and it had somehow found its way to the woods of Kansas. He needed to get help, but he also knew that he couldn't leave the calf alone. He thought quickly, trying to come up with a plan. His grandfather's farm was nearby, and he knew that his grandfather would know what to do. But first, he had to get the calf there. It was then that he noticed the calf's leg was injured, explaining why it hadn't run away. Jake took off his jacket and wrapped it gently around the calf's leg, hoping to provide some support. The calf watched him with trusting eyes, and Jake felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had to get this animal to safety. With a determined nod, he stood up and began to lead the calf slowly out of the clearing. The calf followed, limping slightly but staying close to Jake. As they made their way through the forest, Jake's mind was a whirl of questions. Where had the calf come from? How had it ended up here? And what would happen to it now? The walk back to the farm seemed to take forever, but eventually they emerged from the woods. The calf hesitated at the edge of the field, but Jake coaxed it forward, and they made their way across the open ground. As they approached the farm, Jake's grandfather, who was working in the yard, looked up and did a double take. His eyes widened in surprise as he took in the sight of the young boy and the baby elephant. "Jake, what in the world?" he began, but Jake cut him off. "Grandpa, I found him in the woods. He's hurt, and we need to help him," Jake said, his voice filled with urgency. His grandfather nodded, his expression serious. "All right, let's get him into the barn. Then we'll figure out what to do next." As they led the calf into the barn, Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew they had a long way to go, but for now, the calf was safe. But as they settled the calf into a makeshift pen, Jake heard a strange noise coming from the edge of the woods, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down his spine. He turned to look, and his heart skipped a beat. There, just beyond the tree line, he saw a shadowy figure watching them. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but Jake felt a chill of fear. What was out there? The sound of the calf's soft whimpers brought him back to the present, and he turned his attention back to the task at hand. But the image of the mysterious figure lingered in his mind, a reminder that this was just the beginning of an adventure that would change his life forever. Chapter 2. Sammy. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden hue over the Harper farm, as Jake and his grandfather, Mr. Harper, worked together to settle the young elephant into the barn. The calf, now more at ease with their presence, had stopped trembling and was tentatively exploring its new surroundings. Jake watched with a mix of awe and concern, still trying to wrap his head around the fact that there was an elephant in his grandfather's barn. "We need to give him a name," Jake said, breaking the silence that had settled over them. His grandfather nodded, a thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "How about Sammy?" Jake suggested, the name popping into his head, as if it had always belonged to the little elephant. "It suits him, don't you think?" Mr. Harper chuckled softly, nodding in agreement. "Sammy it is, then. Now, we need to figure out what to do next." Jake knew his grandfather was right. They couldn't keep Sammy hidden forever, but he also knew that the calf was in danger. He had seen the shadowy figure in the woods, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was looking for Sammy. As they worked, Jake's mind raced with questions. Where had Sammy come from? Why was he here, in Kansas? And what was the connection between the mysterious figure and the little elephant? Later that evening, after Sammy had been fed and settled for the night, Jake sat in the barn watching the calf sleep. The moonlight streamed through the cracks in the barn walls, casting a soft glow over the scene. It was then that he noticed something glinting around Sammy's neck. Curious, Jake leaned closer, gently lifting the object for a better look. It was a small, intricately designed medallion, unlike anything he had ever seen before. The metal was cool to the touch, and the design was etched with strange symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary piece of jewelry. It looked ancient, and there was something about it that seemed almost magical. He turned it over in his hands, examining it closely. The medallion was attached to a sturdy chain, and it felt heavy with significance. As he studied it, Jake realized that the medallion was more than just a decoration. It was a key to something important. But what? And how did it connect to Sammy? His mind whirled with possibilities. Could this medallion be the reason Sammy was here? Was it the reason someone was after him? The questions multiplied, and Jake felt a growing sense of urgency. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. He decided to do some research. The internet might have some clues. Or perhaps there were books in the library that could help. But first, he needed to keep Sammy safe. He knew that the barn was only a temporary solution, and he needed to find a more secure place for the calf. As he sat there, contemplating his next move, Jake felt a sense of determination settle over him. He had stumbled into something much bigger than he had ever imagined, but he was ready to face it. Sammy was counting on him, and he wouldn't let the little elephant down. The next morning, Jake woke up early, his mind made up. He would start by talking to his grandfather, Mr. Harper had lived in Maplewood his whole life, and he might have some insights into the medallion or Sammy's origins. As he entered the kitchen, he found his grandfather sitting at the table, sipping a cup of coffee. Mr. Harper looked up as Jake entered, a knowing smile on his face. "I see you're up early," he said, gesturing for Jake to join him. "What's on your mind, son?" Jake took a deep breath, then launched into an explanation of the medallion and his suspicions about its significance. His grandfather listened intently, his expression growing serious as Jake spoke. When he finished, Mr. Harper leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "I think you're onto something, Jake. That medallion might be the key to understanding why Sammy is here. But we need to be careful. If someone is after him, we don't want to draw attention to ourselves." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of relief. His grandfather's support meant everything, and he knew they would figure this out together. As they sat there, planning their next steps, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a feeling that this was just the beginning of an incredible adventure, and he was ready to see where it would lead. But as they talked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the horizon. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the fields. But in the distance, he thought he saw a shadow moving a shadow that sent a down his spine. The medallion felt heavy in his pocket, a reminder that danger was lurking just out of sight. But Jake was determined to protect Sammy, no matter what it took. He knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them head-on. And so, with a deep breath, Jake prepared to embark on the adventure of a lifetime, with Sammy by his side and the mysterious medallion as his guide. Chapter 3. The First Hurdles. The morning after Sammy's arrival, the Harper farm was abuzz with a sense of urgency. Jake and his grandfather, Mr. Harper, were determined to care for the young elephant, but they quickly realized that they were in uncharted territory. Elephants were not exactly common in Kansas, and they had no experience with the specific needs of such a creature. Sammy, although initially calm, soon began to show signs of distress. He refused to eat the hay and fruits that Jake and his grandfather offered, and his energy seemed to be waning. Jake watched with growing concern as the little elephant lay listlessly in the makeshift pen they had set up in the barn. "We need to get him to eat something," Jake said, his voice tinged with desperation. "He won't make it if he doesn't get some nourishment." Mr. Harper nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "I agree, Jake, but we need to figure out what he likes. Elephants have specific dietary needs, and we can't afford to get it wrong." They spent the morning researching online and making phone calls to local zoos and wildlife experts. The consensus was that Sammy needed a diet rich in fiber and nutrients, but the challenge was getting him to eat. Despite their best efforts, Sammy turned away from every offering, his eyes dull and his movements sluggish. As the day wore on, Sammy's condition worsened. His breathing became labored, and he seemed to be losing strength by the hour. Jake felt a knot of fear in his stomach. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Sammy, not after everything they had been through. In a last-ditch effort, Jake decided to try something different. He remembered reading about the importance of hydration for elephants, so he filled a large bucket with fresh water and placed it in front of Sammy. To his relief, the little elephant drank eagerly, his thirst evident. But while the water helped, it wasn't enough. Sammy still refused to eat, and his health continued to decline. Jake was at his wit's end, trying to think of anything that might help. It was then that a stranger appeared at the farm, seemingly out of nowhere. He was a tall man, with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Carter, a wildlife veterinarian, who had heard about Sammy's plight through the local grapevine. "I understand you have a young elephant in need of help," Dr. Carter said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I might be able to assist." Jake and his grandfather exchanged a wary glance. They were hesitant to trust a stranger, but they were also desperate for any help they could get. Dr. Carter seemed to sense their hesitation. "I have experience with exotic animals, including elephants," he explained. "I can assess Sammy's condition and recommend a course of action." After a moment's deliberation, Mr. Harper nodded. "All right, come on in, but we'll be watching you closely." Dr. Carter entered the barn, his movements confident and practiced. He approached Sammy slowly, speaking to him in a soothing tone. The little elephant watched him with wary eyes, but didn't shy away. Dr. Carter examined Sammy thoroughly, checking his vital signs and inspecting his mouth and eyes. After a few minutes, he stood up and turned to Jake and his grandfather. "Sammy's in a bad way," he said gravely. "He's dehydrated and malnourished, and he's showing signs of stress. But I think I know what might help." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small vial of liquid. "This is a special electrolyte solution. It should help with the dehydration and give him some energy. But, more importantly, we need to find out what's causing his refusal to eat." Jake felt a surge of hope. "What do you need us to do?" Dr. Carter smiled faintly. "First, let's get him to drink this. Then, we need to observe him closely and see if we can identify any patterns or triggers for his behavior." As they worked together to administer the solution, Jake felt a glimmer of optimism. With Dr. Carter's help, maybe they could get Sammy back on track. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the barn, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Sammy's condition than met the eye. The appearance of Dr. Carter was a stroke of luck, but it also raised questions. How had he known about Sammy? And what was his real agenda? The answers, it seemed, would have to wait. For now, the focus was on saving Sammy. But Jake knew that the mystery surrounding the little elephant was far from over. Chapter 4. The Mystery of the Medallion. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a deep orange glow across the Kansas sky as Jake, his grandfather, and Dr. Carter gathered around the makeshift pen in the barn. Sammy, having drunk the electrolyte solution, seemed slightly more alert, his eyes following their movements with a wary curiosity. Despite the small improvement, the air was thick with tension and uncertainty. Dr. Carter leaned against the wooden beam, his expression serious. "There's more to this situation than meets the eye," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "I believe that medallion you found on Sammy is the key to understanding why he's here." Jake's hand instinctively went to the medallion in his pocket, feeling the cool metal against his skin. He had almost forgotten about it in the chaos of the day, but curiosity was piqued. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "How do you know about the medallion?" Dr. Carter hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I've been tracking a group of poachers who have been targeting rare and exotic animals," he explained. "They've been involved in illegal trafficking and experimentation. I believe Sammy was part of one of their experiments." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The idea that someone would harm an innocent animal for their own gain made his blood boil. But he also felt a growing sense of unease. If what Dr. Carter said was true, then Sammy was in even more danger than he had realized. "The medallion," Dr. Carter continued, "is more than just a piece of jewelry. It's a tracking device, a way for the poachers to keep tabs on their acquisitions. It also contains information about Sammy's genetic makeup and the experiments that were performed on him." Jake's mind raced. The medallion had seemed important, but he hadn't imagined it was part of something so sinister. He looked at his grandfather, who was listening intently, his expression grave. "Why would they do this?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter sighed, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sadness. "Some people are willing to do anything for power and profit. They see animals like Sammy as nothing more than tools, objects to be used and discarded. But Sammy is special. He's part of a new generation of genetically modified animals, designed to be stronger, smarter, and more resilient." Jake felt a surge of protectiveness. Sammy was more than just an experiment. He was a living, breathing creature with feelings and needs, and he deserved to live a life free from fear and exploitation. "But why would they let him go?" Jake asked, his mind still trying to piece together the puzzle. Dr. Carter shrugged. "Maybe they lost track of him, or maybe he escaped. Either way, he's a loose end, and they won't rest until they find him." The words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the safety of the barn. Jake felt a knot of fear in his stomach, but he also felt a renewed sense of determination. He wouldn't let the poachers take Sammy away. "What do we do now?" he asked, looking to Dr. Carter for guidance. The veterinarian's expression softened. "First, we need to keep Sammy safe. We need to move him to a more secure location, somewhere they won't think to look. And we need to destroy the medallion, so they can't track him." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of relief. Dr. Carter's plan made sense, and he was grateful for his help. But as he looked at Sammy, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. The little elephant had already been through so much, and now he was caught in the middle of a dangerous game. As they discussed their next steps, Jake's mind drifted back to the medallion. He pulled it out of his pocket, examining it closely. The intricate design seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it held secrets that were just waiting to be uncovered. Dr. Carter noticed his interest and leaned in closer. "Be careful with that," he warned. "It's dangerous in the wrong hands." Jake nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the medallion was more than just a tracking device. There was something about it that seemed almost magical, but he knew that now was not the time to dwell on such things. "We need to move quickly," Dr. Carter said, interrupting his thoughts. "The poachers could be here any minute." Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for the task ahead. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them. With Sammy by his side and Dr. Carter's guidance, he felt a glimmer of hope. As they prepared to leave the barn, Jake glanced at the medallion one last time. It glinted in the dim light, a reminder of the mystery that surrounded Sammy and the danger that lay ahead. But Jake was determined to protect the little elephant, no matter what it took. Chapter 5. Danger Looms. The night was eerily quiet as Jake lay in bed, the events of the day swirling through his mind. Sammy's presence in the barn was a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the safety of the farm. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him, his thoughts consumed by the mysterious medallion and the threat posed by the poachers. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Jake finally gave up on sleep and got dressed. He needed to check on Sammy to make sure the little elephant was safe. As he stepped outside, the crisp morning air filled his lungs, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The farm was still, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. But as Jake approached the barn, he noticed something unusual. Footprints, fresh and distinct, led from the edge of the woods to the barn door. His heart skipped a beat. Someone had been here, and they hadn't come for a friendly visit. He quickened his pace, his mind racing with possibilities. As he entered the barn, he found Sammy sleeping peacefully, unaware of the threat that loomed over him. Jake's grandfather was already there, checking on the calf and making sure everything was secure. "Someone was here," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. "Look at the footprints." Mr. Harper's expression darkened as he examined the ground. "You're right, Jake. We need to be extra careful. I don't like the look of this." They spent the next hour reinforcing the barn's security, adding extra locks and barricades to ensure that Sammy was safe. But the feeling of unease lingered, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As the day wore on, strange things began to happen around the farm. Tools went missing, and mysterious noises echoed from the woods. Jake's nerves were on edge, and he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. Then, in the late afternoon, as he was helping his grandfather with chores, Jake noticed a group of unfamiliar men in the distance, standing at the edge of the property. They were dressed in dark clothing, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses. They didn't approach, but their presence was enough to send a chill down Jake's spine. He alerted his grandfather, who watched the men with a wary eye. "I don't like the look of them," Mr. Harper muttered. "We need to keep an eye on them." As the men lingered, Jake's mind raced. He needed to do something, but he didn't know what. It was then that he remembered the medallion. He had almost forgotten about it in the chaos of the day, but now he realized that it might hold the key to their safety. He excused himself and hurried to his room, where he had hidden the medallion. As he retrieved it, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: small, folded piece of paper tucked inside the chain. His heart pounding, Jake unfolded the paper and read the message scrawled across it. "Jake, if you're reading this, you need to know that your family is in danger. The people after Sammy won't stop until they get what they want. You need to leave, now. Find a safe place and stay hidden. We'll be in touch." The note was unsigned, but Jake knew it was from Dr. Carter. The urgency in the message was clear, and Jake felt a surge of fear. His family was in danger, and he had to act fast. He rushed back to the barn, where his grandfather was still keeping watch. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice urgent. "Now. The note says we're in danger." Mr. Harper's eyes widened as he read the note, and he nodded grimly. "All right, let's move. We need to get Sammy to safety and find a place to hide." As they worked quickly to prepare for their departure, Jake felt a sense of urgency unlike anything he had ever known. The danger was closing in, and they had to get away before it was too late. But as they were about to leave, Jake heard a noise behind him, a soft, menacing chuckle that sent a shiver down his spine. He turned to see one of the men from earlier standing in the doorway, a sinister smile on his face. "Going somewhere?" The man sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. The danger was already here, and they were trapped. Intrigue. As the man advanced, Jake noticed a glint of metal in his hand-knife, poised and ready. But just as he was about to strike, a loud crash echoed through the barn, and the man was knocked to the ground. Jake looked up to see Dr. Carter standing in the doorway, a look of determination on his face. "Run, Jake," Dr. Carter shouted. "I'll hold him off." With no time to argue, Jake and his grandfather grabbed Sammy and fled, the sound of chaos ringing in their ears. They had escaped for now, but the danger was far from over. As they disappeared into the woods, Jake knew that their journey was just beginning, and that they would have to rely on each other to survive. Chapter 6. The Escape. The forest was dense and unforgiving, the trees towering like ancient sentinels as Jake, his grandfather, and Sammy pressed forward. The adrenaline from their narrow escape still coursed through Jake's veins, but he knew they couldn't afford to slow down. The poachers were relentless, and they wouldn't stop until they had Sammy back. As they trudged through the underbrush, Jake's mind raced with questions. Where could they go? How would they stay hidden? And what about his family? The note from Dr. Carter had warned that his family was in danger, and the thought of them being hurt was almost too much to bear. But for now, his focus had to be on getting Sammy to safety. The little elephant followed closely behind, his large eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. Jake reached out to stroke his trunk, offering what comfort he could. "We'll find a safe place, Sammy," he whispered, hoping his words were true. The journey was arduous, the terrain rough and unfamiliar. They had to cross streams and navigate through thickets, all while keeping an eye out for any signs of pursuit. Jake's grandfather, though strong and resilient, was beginning to show signs of fatigue. But he pressed on, driven by the same determination that fueled Jake. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, they paused to rest in a small clearing. Sammy drank from a nearby stream, his thirst evident, while Jake and his grandfather caught their breath. It was then that Jake noticed something glinting in the distance, a small cabin, partially hidden by the trees. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing towards the structure. His grandfather nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "It might be a safe place to rest for the night. Let's check it out." They approached cautiously, wary of any potential threats. But as they drew closer, it became clear that the cabin was abandoned, its windows boarded up and its door hanging ajar. Inside, the air was musty and thick with dust, but it was shelter, and that was what they needed. As they settled in, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He peered out the window, scanning the surrounding woods for any signs of movement. But all was still. The only sound, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. That night, as they huddled together for warmth, Jake's thoughts turned to his parents. He hadn't seen them in years, not since they had left on a research expedition to Africa. They had promised to return, but as the years passed, Jake had begun to lose hope. Now, more than ever, he wished they were here. As he drifted into a restless sleep, he was jolted awake by a noise outside. He sat up, his heart pounding, and listened intently. The sound came again, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the door. Jake's grandfather stirred, waking up and following Jake's gaze towards the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but wary. There was a pause, and then a voice replied, "I'm a friend. I mean you no harm." Jake and his grandfather exchanged a glance, uncertainty etched on their faces. But the voice sounded genuine, and they were desperate for any help they could get. "Come in," Jake's grandfather said finally, his voice cautious. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He introduced himself as Ethan, a wildlife photographer who'd been tracking the poachers for months. "I heard about your situation," Ethan said, his voice filled with sympathy. "I might be able to help." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know about us?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then said, "I know your parents. They asked me to keep an eye out for you." Jake's mind reeled. His parents? After all these years, could it be true? "Where are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's expression softened. "They're in Africa, working on a project to stop the poaching of elephants. They wanted to come back for you, but they couldn't risk jeopardizing their mission. They asked me to make sure you were safe." Jake felt a surge of emotions relief, anger, sadness, and hope all mixed together. His parents were alive, and they were fighting to protect animals like Sammy. But they were also far away, and he couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. As Ethan explained their plan to move to a more secure location, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it. With Sammy by his side, and the knowledge that his parents were out there, fighting for the same cause, he felt a glimmer of hope. And so, with a deep breath, Jake prepared to continue their journey, knowing that the adventure of a lifetime awaited them. The danger was far from over, but he was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. As they prepared to leave, Ethan handed Jake a small folded piece of paper. "Your parents wanted you to have this," he said. "They said it would explain everything." Jake took the paper, his heart pounding with anticipation. What secrets did it hold? And what would it mean for his future? As he unfolded it, he knew that his life was about to change forever. Chapter 7: A New Hope. The small cabin was filled with a tense silence as Jake sat on the dusty floor, the folded piece of paper Ethan had given him clutched tightly in his hands. His mind raced with a whirlwind of emotions, excitement, fear, hope, and uncertainty all vied for dominance. The revelation that his parents were alive and actively working to protect animals like Sammy had shaken him to his core. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and then carefully unfolded the paper. The message inside was brief, but packed with information. His parents had been part of an international project dedicated to the protection and conservation of rare and endangered animals, particularly elephants. They had been working undercover, gathering evidence against the poaching rings that threatened these majestic creatures. Sammy's presence in their lives was no accident. He was part of a new generation of elephants, bred in captivity, as part of a program to reintroduce genetically diverse populations into the wild. The poachers had somehow gotten wind of the project and were determined to capture Sammy for their own nefarious purposes. Jake's heart swelled with pride and admiration for his parents. They were out there, risking their lives to make a difference. But he also felt a pang of longing. He missed them terribly and wished they were here with him now. As he read on, the message contained instructions on how to contact an organization that was allied with his parents. They could provide assistance and protection, but the message also warned that the situation was fraught with danger. The poachers were relentless, and they had eyes everywhere. Jake's grandfather, who had been reading over his shoulder, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Your parents are brave people, Jake, and they're doing important work. But we need to be careful. We don't know who we can trust." Jake nodded, his mind made up. "I know, Grandpa, but we need help. We can't do this alone." He took out the medallion, which he had kept hidden, and examined it closely. The intricate design seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and Jake realized that it might hold the key to contacting the organization. He turned to Ethan, who had been waiting patiently. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked, holding up the medallion. Ethan nodded, a look of understanding on his face. "Yes, I believe so. It's a communication device. It should allow us to send a message to the organization." Jake felt a surge of relief. "Let's do it then." Ethan took the medallion and began to manipulate it, his fingers moving deftly over the surface. After a few moments, a small light blinked on, and a soft hum filled the air. "We've made contact," Ethan said, his voice filled with cautious optimism. The response was almost immediate. A voice, distorted but clear, came through the medallion. "This is Operation Elephant. We received your message. What is your status?" Jake took a deep breath and began to explain their situation, detailing their encounter with the poachers and their need for assistance. The voice on the other end listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification. When Jake finished, there was a pause, and then the voice spoke again. "We can help you, but we need to meet in person. We have a safe location, but we must warn you could be a trap. The poachers are cunning, and they may be trying to lure you out." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. The thought of walking into a trap was terrifying, but he knew they had no other choice. They needed help, and this was their best chance. He looked at his grandfather and Ethan, who both nodded in agreement. "We'll do it," Jake said, his voice firm. "Just tell us where and when." The voice on the other end gave them the details of the meeting place, a remote clearing deep in the forest, far from prying eyes. They agreed on a time, and the connection was severed. As they prepared for the meeting, Jake felt a mix of fear and determination. The danger was real, and the stakes were high, but he also felt a glimmer of hope. With the organization's help, maybe they could finally put an end to the poacher's reign of terror and protect Sammy and other animals like him. Intrigue. As they set out for the meeting, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest was eerily quiet, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a shiver down his spine. He knew that the poachers were out there, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were walking into a trap. But he pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. They had come too far to turn back now. With Sammy by his side and his grandfather and Ethan by his side, Jake felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The journey to the clearing was long and fraught with tension. But as they finally arrived, Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. The clearing was empty, but he knew that the organization would be there soon. As they waited, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. What would the organization be like? Would they be able to help? And most importantly, would they be able to stop the poachers once and for all? Only time would tell. But for now, Jake was determined to hold on to hope that they were on the right path. Chapter 8. The Trap. The clearing was bathed in an eerie silence as Jake, his grandfather, Ethan, and Sammy waited anxiously for the representatives of Operation Elephant to arrive. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of wildlife muted, as if the very land was aware of the danger that lurked nearby. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of anticipation and dread coursing through him. He glanced at Sammy, who stood close by, his large eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. The little elephant had been through so much, and Jake was determined to protect him, no matter the cost. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. The appointed time for the meet came and went, and still, there was no sign of the organization. Jake's grandfather shifted uneasily, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Something's not right," he muttered, his voice low and wary. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "I agree. We should have heard from them by now." Just then, a rustling sound came from the underbrush, and Jake's heart leapt into his throat. He turned, expecting to see the representatives of Operation Elephant, but instead, a group of men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by masks. Jake's blood ran cold. These were not the allies they had been expecting. These were the poachers, and they had walked right into their trap. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, stepping protectively in front of Sammy. The men advanced, their movements deliberate and menacing. Jake's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but he refused to give up. Suddenly, one of the men lunged forward, grabbing for Sammy. Jake reacted instinctively, throwing himself in the way. The impact knocked him to the ground, but he scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. He glanced around, looking for anything that could give them an advantage. That's when he saw a small, hidden path, leading into the woods, just beyond the clearing. "Follow me," he shouted, grabbing Sammy's trunk and pulling him towards the path. His grandfather and Ethan followed, the three of them and Sammy, making a desperate dash for the trees. The poachers gave chase, their shouts echoing through the forest. Jake's heart pounded as they ran, the trees whipping past them in a blur. He could hear the poachers closing in, their footsteps heavy and relentless. But he refused to slow down. His mind focused on one thing: getting Sammy to safety. As they reached a small ravine, Jake's heart sank. The path ended abruptly, the ground falling away into a steep drop. They were trapped, with nowhere to go. But just as despair threatened to overtake him, a voice called out from the trees, "Over here!" Jake turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, a young woman, her face familiar, yet unexpected. It was Mia, a girl from his school who had always been a bit of a mystery. She had a reputation for being adventurous and resourceful, and now Jake understood why. "This way!" she shouted, gesturing towards a narrow trail that led down into the ravine. With no time to question her motives, Jake and the others followed her, scrambling down the steep slope. The poachers hesitated at the edge, unwilling to risk the dangerous descent. As they reached the bottom, Mia led them to a small cave, hidden from view. "We should be safe here for now," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jake looked at her, his mind racing with questions. "How did you know we were here, and why are you helping us?" Mia smiled faintly, her eyes filled with a determination that matched his own. "I've been tracking the poachers for a while now. I knew they were planning something, had to help. When I saw you in the clearing, I knew I had to act." Jake felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Mia nodded, her expression serious. "We need to keep moving. The poachers won't give up easily." As they prepared to leave the cave, Jake felt a renewed sense of hope. With Mia's help, maybe they could finally outsmart the poachers and find a way to safety. Intrigue. As they set out, Mia handed Jake a small device. "This will help us stay in contact," she explained. "But we need to be careful. The poachers are smart, and they have eyes everywhere." Jake nodded, feeling a mix of relief and determination. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but with Mia by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Jake felt a glimmer of hope that they might just make it through. Chapter 9. Coming Home. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the familiar landscape as Jake, Sammy, and their newfound ally Mia made their way back to the Harper farm. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but they had managed to evade the poachers, at least for now. As the farm came into view, Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. They were home, but he knew their adventure was far from over. The barn, once a place of safety and refuge, now seemed like a reminder of the challenges they still faced. Sammy, sensing their arrival, let out a soft trumpet, his eyes filled with a mix of joy and wariness. Jake reached out to stroke his trunk, offering what comfort he could. "We'll figure this out, Sammy," he whispered, more to himself than to the little elephant. As they entered the barn, Jake's grandfather and Ethan were waiting for them, their expressions a mix of relief and concern. "Thank goodness you're safe, mister," Harper said, pulling Jake into a tight hug. Jake nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for his grandfather's unwavering support. "We're okay, Grandpa, but we can't stay here. It's not safe." Ethan nodded in agreement. "The poachers are still out there, and they won't give up easily. We need to find a more secure location." As they discussed their options, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. They needed a plan, a way to protect Sammy and other animals like him from the poachers' relentless pursuit. But more than that, he needed answers. Why had his parents left him, and what was their role in all of this? It was then that he remembered the letter Ethan had given him earlier. In the chaos of the escape, he had forgotten all about it. He retrieved it from his pocket, his heart pounding with anticipation. The letter was written in his mother's familiar handwriting. And as he read, Jake felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and understanding all vied for dominance. "Dear Jake," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means that you're in the middle of something much bigger than any of us could have imagined. We never wanted to leave you, but we had to follow our hearts and our convictions. The work we're doing is dangerous, but it's important. We're fighting to protect animals like Sammy, to give them a chance at a life free from fear and exploitation. We know we can't do it alone, and that's why we've reached out to people we trust, like Ethan and the members of Operation Elephant. They're our allies, and they're here to help you. We wish we could be there with you, but we know that you're strong and capable. You have the courage and the determination to see this through. Please know that we love you more than anything, and we're doing everything we can to come back to you. Until then, stay safe, and know that we're with you in spirit. With all our love, Mom and Dad." Tears welled up in Jake's eyes as he finished reading the letter. He felt a deep sense of connection to his parents, a bond that transcended the miles and the danger that separated them. They were out there fighting for the same cause, and he knew that he had to do his part. He turned to his grandfather, Ethan, and Mia, his resolve strengthened. "We need to protect Sammy and other animals like him," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to find a way to stop the poachers and make sure they can't hurt anyone else." His grandfather nodded, a proud smile on his face. "You're right, Jake. We need to work together and come up with a plan." As they began to strategize, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it. With his friends and family by his side, he felt confident that they could make a difference. Intrigue. As they talked, Jake's thoughts turned to the medallion, which he had kept hidden. He realized that it might hold the key to contacting Operation Elephant and coordinating their efforts. But he also knew that it was a double-edged sword, a beacon that could get his attention. He decided to keep it a secret for now, until he could figure out the best way to use it. But as he looked at Sammy, he knew that the little elephant was counting on him, and he was determined to do whatever it took to keep him safe. The adventure was far from over, but Jake was ready to see it through, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. The sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, as Jake stood at the edge of the newly established sanctuary, Sammy by his side. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of activity, but they had finally found a safe haven for Sammy and other animals rescued from the clutches of the poachers. The sanctuary, nestled in a remote valley and surrounded by lush forests, was a place of hope and new beginnings. With the help of Operation Elephant and other allies, they had transformed the once-abandoned farm into a thriving refuge. Volunteers from all over the country had come to lend a hand, and the community had rallied together to support their cause. Jake felt a deep sense of pride as he looked around at the fruits of their labor. They had created something truly special, a place where animals could live free from fear and harm. Sammy, now healthy and full of energy, roamed the sanctuary with a joyful abandon, his trumpet echoing through the air. Jake watched him with a smile, feeling a profound sense of connection to the little elephant. They had been through so much together, and their bond was unbreakable. As the days passed, the sanctuary became a symbol of the fight to protect rare and endangered animals. People from all over the world came to visit, inspired by the story of Jake and Sammy and the difference they were making. Jake found himself giving talks and interviews, sharing their story and raising awareness about the plight of elephants and other animals threatened by poaching. But despite the sanctuary's success, Jake knew that their work was far from over. The poachers were still out there, and the fight to protect wildlife was an ongoing battle. But he was determined to continue the fight, to make the world a safer place for animals like Sammy. One evening, as he sat on the porch of the old farmhouse, watching the sunset, Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had found his purpose, and he was surrounded by people who shared his passion and commitment. But there was still one thing missing: his parents. He had thought about them often, wondering where they were and what they were doing. The letter they had left him had given him some closure, but he still longed to see them, to talk to them, to share his experiences and hear their stories. It was then that he remembered the medallion, which he had kept hidden away. He had been hesitant to use it, fearing that it might attract unwanted attention, but now he felt ready to take the risk. He retrieved the medallion from its hiding place and examined it closely. The intricate design seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and Jake felt a surge of hope. He knew that it was a long shot, but he had to try. He activated the device, his heart pounding with anticipation. After a few moments, a voice came through, faint but clear. "This is Operation Elephant. Who's calling?" Jake took a deep breath and explained who he was and what he was trying to do. The voice on the other end listened intently, then said, "Hold on, Jake. We'll see what we can do." The wait was agonizing, but finally, the voice returned. "We've made contact with your parents. They're on their way back. They should be there in a few days." Jake's heart soared with joy and relief. His parents were coming home, and he would finally get to see them again. The news was almost too good to be true, but he trusted that it was real. As the days passed, Jake counted down the hours until their arrival. And then, one bright morning, he saw them two familiar figures walking up the path to the sanctuary. His parents, at last. Tears filled his eyes as he ran to meet them, throwing his arms around them in a fierce embrace. They held each other for a long moment, the years of separation melting away in an instant. "I'm so proud of you, Jake," his mother said, her voice filled with emotion. "You've done something amazing here." His father nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "You've grown into a fine young man, son, and we're so grateful to have you in our lives." As they walked together towards the sanctuary, Jake felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had found his place in the world, and he had reunited with his family. The adventure had been long and challenging, but it had been worth it. Intrigue. As they settled into their new life at the sanctuary, Jake knew that there were still many challenges ahead, but he also knew that he had the strength and the support to face them. And as he looked at Sammy, he realized that his journey was just beginning. There were animals to save, more battles to fight, and more adventures to be had. But for now, he was content to enjoy the moment, surrounded by the people and animals he loved. The future was uncertain, but he was ready to embrace it, knowing that he was part of something much bigger than himself.